Hi everyone, today I'm going to be talking to you about soprano jazz style mouthpiece setups, and I'm here to tell you first and foremost that you may have been doing it wrong this whole time. So I'm going to propose that choosing a mouthpiece setup on the soprano if you want to play in a jazz style can actually be the opposite way round to that of choosing a tenor mouthpiece setup. With the idea in mind that with a tenor setup, we often go for that wider tip opening and slightly softer reed, but it can work the opposite way round on the soprano with that narrower mouthpiece and slightly harder reed. So let's explore this topic with some real live examples of different mouthpiece setups. And I'm also going to do a little bit of a spotlight on this latest release from BetterSax. This is their new curved soprano. So the general thinking here is that when we're trying to play in more jazz-based styles, having a wider tip opening and a softer reed can give us more flexibility in sound, greater scope for tonal colours, and also greater scope for a bigger dynamic range. And this is certainly the case on tenor, it can be the case on alto as well. And when we apply it to soprano, it's also the case we can get that wider colour palette and we can certainly get a big dynamic range. So let me just demonstrate with quite a wide tip mouthpiece right here. This is a Theowani, what have we got? This is the Durga in a tip opening 8. And I've got a very soft reed here. This is a Select Jazz 2 soft. So let's see what results we get first of all before we discuss. Don't worry, the soprano playing is going to get better. And I don't mean any offense at all to Theo with this particular mouthpiece, because it could be great in the right player's hands and with the right setup, so a different reed and a different approach to the playing. But initially, I'm just kind of all over the place with the control of this particular mouthpiece setup, the intonations all over the place. It's a nice bright sound which can be really useful for various types of applications. I was just struggling just to get to grips with the basic center of the sound there, so I didn't particularly get anywhere. And this really demonstrates the main point I'm making, which is that when we change this around, and I will do in just a minute, to the complete opposite setup, so a smaller tip opening and a harder reed, suddenly we regain control of the instrument again. If we're to apply this same setup to a tenor, I don't mind that softer reed and the wider tip. I find that I can gain the control on a tenor sax with that kind of setup. I wouldn't necessarily go as soft as a 2 soft reed, which is what I've got here, but that's just to demonstrate the point, which is that the intonation on the soprano, all those little discrepancies, they're magnified on a soprano sax compared to that of, an alto or a tenor, and we certainly heard it there. So that is why the argument that a more stable setup where we have a smaller tip opening and a harder reed will grasp back that control that we so desire and desperately need, particularly in the second octave of the soprano. So let's just flick this over straight away. I'm going to go to the polar opposite. I'm going to go to a Selmer S80 C star, which we typically associate with much more of a classical setup. We'll just see how we get on with that first of all before discussing the various merits of what that setup can offer us in terms of the different styles that we want to play in. So bear with me a second. Okay, so the demonstration wasn't perfect, but you could hear that I was in a much better place there. I'm not always playing the soprano in the same way that I'm playing a lot more tenor and alto. But I find that when the setup is right for me on the soprano, I can just kind of lock back into gear. And I think just given a couple of days with this kind of setup, to remind you, this is the Selmer SAT. It's just a C star with a much harder reed. This is a 3 medium jazz select reed. And finally, we now have much more centered sound with a very pleasant overall voice to it. The intonation is there. It's stable. So what I mean by the stability thing is that when we have that harder reed, because we need to apply more pressure naturally with the soprano embouchure, because it's a smaller mouthpiece and it just requires it in order to make the sound speak. If we have that softer reed, that's when we get all that flabbiness in tone that I demonstrated a minute or so back with the Theo setup. Whereas with this reed, because it's so much stiffer, we get that resistance there and we get that stability in tone and intonation as we rise up through the range of the instrument. It's also just generally a very pleasant sound. You might sort of say, well, how do we project when the tip opening is so small? And honestly, it does look absolutely tiny. I'm kind of amazed myself that you can project so much. But it is possible, the fact the reed isn't actually closing up on the tip of the mouthpiece, so we still have a decent amount of aperture there for the air to get through in order to produce that sound. I think that's one aspect of it. It's not closing up on the tip like it would have been with that Theo Wani setup. So even though the tip opening is vast with that Durga there, the reed is just closing up because we need that firmer embouchure. So ultimately, we don't then have the airflow going through the actual mouthpiece setup. So that's the kind of technical side as to what is happening. But it's just curious because it works very nicely on the soprano for me. I find that you can get that kind of classical style of sound that I've hopefully demonstrated there. But also at the same time, if you move into jazz styles of playing, which is kind of largely what comes more naturally to me and what I've practiced myself personally, I find that this setup works very nicely. Let's just try and prove this theory a little more by just looking at another setup. And actually, it ties in very nicely with this curved soprano, the release of this new session, which is really great. I love this new release by BetterSax. And it comes with its own mouthpiece, which is the classic mouthpiece. It's just a basic student-style mouthpiece. It's a plastic mouthpiece, but it also has a very small tip opening. So it's interesting now just to kind of compare this with the very well-known S80 mouthpiece and see how it compares sound-wise and response, but intonation and the control, all the things we've just been talking about. Because I do believe that this is a really good mouthpiece from the point of view of finding that ideal setup that just works across all spectrums, as I've been talking about today. Yeah, so it's a really nice sounding piece. Considering the fact that this is basically a student mouthpiece, I think the qualities of it are fantastic. Lovely tone. Again, if I spent a bit more time, I would tweak the tuning. I would just find the spot where it speaks perfectly with the response and the tuning and all the rest of it. But straight out of the bag, it feels really great to me. And in a very similar vein to the really well-known Selmer mouthpieces, if I'm choosing between the two of them, I'm not finding that the Selmer is vastly better than the classic, actually. So, yeah, great little mouthpiece, working very well with this new curved soprano. So, all in all, a very nice setup. But back to the main point of the video, I hope you can hear that really the difference between those two setups, for me, personally, is chalk and cheese. Yes, give me another go on that wider tip mouthpiece with the softer reed, because I might find that if you give me an hour or so just playing into it, and finding where the pitching is, and then just altering the embouchure to allow for that flexibility, it might start happening for me. But I find what happens is that you need to have that pinpoint accuracy with the embouchure, otherwise the intonation just wanders like crazy. For me personally anyway, on the Theo mouthpiece. For others out there who play the soprano much more than me, you might find that wider tip works perfectly well. It's just not quite happening for me. But I'm going to finish up by playing my typical setup on the soprano, which is actually a compromise point. I play typically an Otto Link 6-star with like a medium strength reed. It would be a 3-soft select jazz. And I kind of feel like I've got the best of both worlds with that style of setup. But I'm not adverse to moving to something more like what I've demonstrated here with the BetterSax Classic or the Selmer S80. I just don't play enough soprano to really have got into considering whether I need to look at a different setup or not. But I'm just making the basic point today that these setups can change the game radically on soprano saxophone, as I've demonstrated so far. So let's just move finally on to an Otto Link 6-star with a medium strength reed and see how that compares to the two more extreme examples that you've heard so far.